And good evening again, everybody, and welcome to week 6 of Better Understand the Bible. And tonight we begin the New Testament, and we begin talking about the Gospels and the book of Acts. You could argue that a Christian church teaching about the Bible should start with the Gospels and the book of Acts. I understand that entirely. But what we're going to hopefully see tonight is how all of these books that we've been talking about in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, have been building up this story over and over and over again until it finds its culmination in the story of Jesus, in Jesus's life, in Jesus's ministry, and in Jesus's legacy, as we see that start to be played out in the book of Acts. So we're going to start with an overview of the Gospels and Acts. 5 books, obviously: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Acts of the Apostles. They tell the story of Jesus's life. They tell the story of Jesus's ministry. And like I said, most importantly, that legacy of Jesus's teaching as it goes forth into the world through the apostles. And that propagation of Jesus's legacy is what we're swimming in right now here today. When we're talking about authorship, again, as much as we've been talking in Old Testament books about how books are traditionally authored by the folks that are named within them, that's what we're dealing here with the Gospels again. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are attributed to those 4 gentlemen, but we don't have concrete evidence that those are the people that actually wrote them. It could be stories that propagated down through those folks. It could be that they actually put pen to paper. We don't know, because none of the Gospels in there say, I, Luke, wrote this gospel. We see that sometimes in Paul's letters, which we'll talk about a little bit next week. But you don't see anything like that in the Gospels themselves. There are hints. There are small bits of evidences that lead us to believe that perhaps these apostles wrote these particular Gospels, but we don't know for sure exactly who wrote what. We can dig into a little bit more with each individual book why we think these particular authors or who these particular authors actually were. When it comes to the type of literature that we're talking about with the Bible, again, it's primarily historical narrative. Some folks will argue that this should be fully biographical designation, fully biography. I don't like using that term biography when it comes to biblical books, because when we think of biographies, and we've said this throughout the entire series, when we think in modern times of biographies, we think of very specific way of writing about somebody, and that's not how the ancient authors did it. So I prefer the term historical narrative. Again, doesn't make it ahistoric whatsoever, but we do have to recognize that each of these 4 authors is shaping the story of Jesus's life, is shaping their telling of the story of Jesus's life according to specific rhetorical goals. And we'll talk about those as we go through each individual book. And that is clearly a departure from how we view history in modern terms. But the thing of it is, when we're judging ancient historical texts, we have to judge them in their own context. We have to judge them in terms of how history was written at the time that these texts were written. If you judge the Gospels historicity, if you judge their value based on how we view historical texts today, well, no, they don't hold up to those standards. But nobody should expect them to hold up to those standards, because that's not how people viewed histories back then. That's not how they wrote histories back then. And so by the terms of how we judge ancient historical texts, the Gospels hold up remarkably, remarkably well. And there's plenty of information in the Gospels that you wouldn't, if you were making this story up, if you were trying to invent a story, there's all kinds of little bits of information in the Gospels and in the book of Acts that you wouldn't at all include. It just would make no sense to include it. You'd be trying to shape the story in such a specific way that you wouldn't have these little details in there. You wouldn't have the way that Luke brings Roman history into his gospel. You wouldn't do that if you were just trying to invent a story. So as ancient texts go, the Gospels hold up remarkably, remarkably well. Of the 4 Gospels, there are 3 that are referred to as the synoptic Gospels. That may be a term that you're either loosely familiar with or not at all familiar with. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, taken together, are called the synoptic Gospels. Synoptic comes from the Greek word synoptikos, which literally translates to able to be seen together. The synoptic Gospels are grouped together because they share a bunch of information, and we're going to see a graphic here in a minute that kind of describes how much information they share. And they generally tell the story of Jesus's life from a particular point of view, which is different from how John tells it. So I want to show you this graphic here, and then I'm going to explain it a little bit. So let me share screen for a moment so that you can see it. All right, you should now be seeing this handy dandy little graphic here that lists Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what you'll notice is there's a shared bit of information. Mark is considered to be the oldest of the four gospels. And part of the reason that they believe that that's true is, if you'll notice, 76% of the information that's in Mark can be found in Luke and also found in Matthew. It is believed, like I said, Mark wrote first. Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark as they wrote their gospels. This percentage of sharing sort of verifies that to a degree. You'll also notice that Matthew and Luke, who are writing presumably around the same time, we'll talk about dates here in a second, share common information that isn't found in Mark. And this leads scholars to believe that there was actually a second source that Matthew and Luke were both looking at as they constructed their gospels. This source in academic circles is referred to as Q, which is from a German word, and I forget exactly what the word is. But anyway, point being that there seems to have been another source, which we now don't have, which is why scholars debate whether it actually existed or not. But there is this remarkably large percentage of information that both Luke and Matthew share that isn't found in Mark. There's also little bits of Mark that you see specifically in Luke and not Matthew, and a little bit of Mark that you see in Matthew but not Luke. And of course, each Matthew and Luke both have their own individual little bits of information that they have as well. So it's just interesting to see the connection from those three gospels, but there's a bunch of connection there. And that kind of connection isn't necessarily found in John, which is why John's left out of this synoptic gospel group. One of the bits of information that gets shared or that's common is people are familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. We find that in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. I had you read Luke chapter 6 because that's referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. And if you read Luke chapter 6, you see a lot of things in that chapter that are very, very reminiscent of the Sermon on the Mount. What does this mean? Does this mean that Jesus gave this one sermon one time, and Matthew decided to put him on a mount, and Luke decided to put him on a plain? Possibly. But I like to think Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He roamed all around the countryside preaching very much the same thing over and over again. And as somebody who's done preaching, I can tell you firsthand that sometimes you repeat a sermon in a different location because that group hasn't heard it yet, and it's something that you have down and can present well to that particular group of people. So I like to think that the sermon that Matthew recorded on the Mount was the same material, though given at a different time when Luke describes it in the Sermon on the Plain. But that's a bit of information that you see, even though the context is different, it's the same kind of information that's common to multiple gospels. So dating wise, as I said, Mark is generally considered to be the oldest of the four gospels. The scholars will date him anywhere between 40 and 70 AD. If you think about it, Jesus lived into the early 30s AD. So if it's that early that Mark is being written down in 40 AD, that's less than 10 years after Jesus has left that this gospel is starting to be written down. Even if it's as late as 70 AD, that's less than a generation after Jesus' death that Mark is already writing down his story. Matthew, presumably somewhere between 60 and 90 AD. Luke and Acts, we'll talk about them, why they're considered together, were somewhere between 70 and 90 as well. And then John is the latest of the four gospels, that presumably written somewhere between 80 and 100 AD. Now, those dates are loose, and you will find scholars that will date these all to a later date. I think there's strong indications, and I won't go into the nuts and bolts of it, but I think there's strong indications that these numbers are fairly reliable in terms of where they are in approximation to Jesus's life. The most important thing to understand there is that even the latest of those gospels, even if you take John being written sometime in 100 AD, there would be people that were only a generation away from Jesus's life living at that period of time. And that for most of the gospel writers, there would have been living witnesses to Jesus's life who existed at the time these stories were certainly being told, but even as the stories were being shared and written down and propagated around the Mediterranean realm. What that means is if these stories were untrue, if there were large untruths in there would have been people alive at the time who saw what happened, who were there when it happened, that could say, hey, wait a minute, that's not how that went. Which again bolsters the credibility of the gospels. I think they were written terribly close to Jesus's life. Considering, we'll use this for reference. The earliest writing that we have for Alexander the Great was written 400 years after he lived. And I don't find a historian that doesn't believe that Alexander the Great actually existed. right? And yet we still have debates from some folks. Most academics have already given up the ghost on this when Jesus actually existed. Whether he was the Son of God or not, that's a whole other debate. But that there was a man roaming around the Sea of Galilee named Jesus of Nazareth is fairly well accepted. So the history contained within the Gospels, they cover the events of Jesus's life from the early aughts. So we're talking about somewhere between 0 and 3 AD that Jesus was born, to his death at the age of 33. So that means we're talking 33 to 36 AD, somewhere in that range, where he was crucified by Rome. Acts, the book of Acts, covers obviously from Jesus' resurrection up through his ascension, up through Paul being in prison in Rome, which we know happened somewhere around 61 AD. So the book of Acts covers roughly 33 AD to 61 AD. So that's the kind of historical period that we're looking in to start with. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second before we dig into the individual books. And I will give everybody the opportunity, if they'd like, to pop in with a question. If there's something that I went through too fast or you want me to go over again, please by all means say so. Which may prompt a question now that we've talked about the chronology here. If Mark was written first, why does Matthew appear first in the Bible? Which is a great question. Unfortunately, the answer isn't a terribly sexy one. It's simply tradition. St. Augustine, who was one of the early church fathers, championed this idea of Matthew having been written first. And that was mostly based on the fact that Matthew starts with a genealogy and then the birth narrative. Mark doesn't have either of those things. And so that's where Augustine decided that's where we should start. And it sort of just worked its way into the canon and became tradition that Matthew is the first book in the Bible. Later literary analysis, which Augustine didn't have access to, demonstrates that Mark was probably written first. But simply by virtue of tradition, Matthew shows up first in the Bible. Again, authorship is credited to Matthew. We've been talking about that, who was one of the apostles. He was the tax collector. The book itself, again, says nothing about who the author is. At no point in the book of Matthew, and truthfully, at no point in any of the four Gospels, does the author say, I, Matthew, I, Mark, I, Luke, I, John, write this particular thing. So scholars tend to think of these as traditionally ascribed to those particular authors. Matthew especially is thought of by a lot of scholars as being an anonymous book altogether that was just at some point later attributed to the Apostle Matthew. What we do know about it is that it was written primarily to a Jewish audience. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, you have a quote from Jesus that says, I have not come to abolish them being the laws, but to fulfill them, which presents Jesus as this greater version of Moses. If you watch the Bible Project video that I assigned, you saw they talked about that in there. It connects Jesus directly to the law, directly to Moses, which is something you would do for a Jewish audience that you wouldn't necessarily do for a Gentile audience. Moses and characters like Abraham wouldn't have as great a resonance with a Gentile audience as they do with a Jewish audience. So the fact that that's mentioned so prominently is part of what leads us to believe that this was specifically meant for a Jewish audience. And there's another piece of information I'll get to here in a second that does the same thing. Interestingly, Matthew also takes a harsh view of Jewish leadership at the time of Jesus. You see Jesus often rebuking religious leaders at his time in the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 23 has what's called the 7 woes. Woe unto you for doing X, Y, or Z. Those are always directed at religious leaders, at the scribes, at the Pharisees, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, that's been interpreted as a criticism of Judaism, as a criticism of the law, which isn't the case. It was specific religious figures. It would be like getting mad at Christianity for the failure of a specific pastor. Matthew was going after the religious elite, not the religion itself of Judaism. Jesus came not to destroy Judaism. Jesus came to fulfill Judaism. That's what he has Jesus saying in this particular gospel. And while the audience was primarily Jewish in nature, Matthew is trying to convince these Jews that the definition of God's people has been redefined to include Gentiles, to include believing Gentiles. Again, another reason you wouldn't make that argument necessarily to a Gentile group unless you were trying to support them, I suppose. But it's far more likely you're making that argument to a Jewish audience. Matthew also collects Jesus's teaching into 5 sections. And remember what we've been talking about, that anytime you see that number 5 in the Bible, there's significance to that number. What's the significance to that number? Well, we're talking about Torah. We're talking about the 5 books of the Torah. So the fact that Jesus' teachings are collected into 5 sections has that meaning attached to it, again, indicating that it's meant for a Jewish audience. We talked earlier about the Sermon on the Mount. That's chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew. His missionary discourse comes in chapter 10. Parables of the kingdom comes in chapter 13. The church in the kingdom comes in chapter 18. And the judgment discourse comes in chapters 24 to 25. Each of those, the way that we've been able to delineate those is that each of them finishes with Matthew writing, when Jesus had finished saying these things, ... and that translates onto the next section of the Bible or onto the next story that he's trying to tell. But if you find one of those phrases and then look backwards a little bit, you'll see there's a chunk of Jesus's teaching, and there's 5 chunks throughout that gospel. So those are some notes about Gospel of Matthew. I'll go through Gospel of Mark, and then we'll pause again for more questions. Mark is the second gospel listed in the in the Bible, and again attributed to a guy by the name of John Mark, who we see actually in some of both talked about in some of Paul's letters and specifically in the book of Acts as being an associate of Peter. So again, we think of this in some ways as Peter's gospel. These are Peter's stories translated down through Mark, and then probably through somebody that followed Mark, and that was who actually wrote them down. Mark is the shortest of the 4 gospels. There's only 16 chapters in Mark, and it's very fast paced. Mark doesn't mess around. Jesus does this, and then Jesus does that, and then Jesus does this, and just boom, 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 away we go. Mark was written primarily to a Greek-speaking audience. So now we're talking about more Gentiles involved here. Hebrew names and Aramaic words are translated in Mark. When he uses one of those words or uses either Hebrew or Aramaic, he'll say meaning something in Greek, obviously originally written in Greek. So he's translating those Hebrew and Aramaic words for a Greek speaking audience. He also, when he starts to discuss Jewish purification rituals, he offers explanations for why those were used. And again, not something you would do if it was a primarily Jewish audience that was reading it. So we believe strongly that this was written for primarily Gentile audience. He's trying to convince his audience that he wants them to see Jesus as a messianic figure, not just a Jewish messianic figure, but a messianic figure for all humanity. He focuses heavily in the Gospel of Mark on the coming of God's kingdom. That word kingdom gets used over and over and over again in Mark's gospel. And what he's talking about there is this new creation of restoration and renewal. We oftentimes get hung up, especially in Western Christianity, on this idea of being really, really good people in this life, so that when we die, we get to go to heaven, which is somewhere apart from this reality, from this broken, chaotic, evil reality. We get to go to the good place and leave all of this behind. And isn't that going to be great when we get to do that? That's not really what the New Testament teaches in large part. And we see a lot of this other idea in Mark, which is that this notion of God's kingdom coming to be with us here at earth, that whatever reality God's kingdom exists in and whatever reality we currently exist in, at some point will fuse together into one new, restored, renewed creation. That's the coming of God's kingdom. And what Jesus is pronouncing in the Gospel of Mark is the beginning of the coming of God's kingdom. That right now, as of Jesus's arrival, we as human beings and going forward can start to bring about bits and pieces of God's kingdom. We can live now as though God's kingdom is already a reality. And by doing so, we spread this notion of peace and grace and mercy and love throughout all of humanity. And we see a ton of that in Mark's gospel. There's 2 basic sections. It kind of divides the gospel in half. The first half of the gospel, which chapter 1 through about midway of chapter 8, is Jesus's ministry in and around Galilee. And then in about the middle of chapter 20 or chapter 8, about verse 27 or so, Jesus pivots and starts heading to Jerusalem. And of course, in Jerusalem is he's heading to his crucifixion and his resurrection. So the gospel divides pretty neatly in half between his public ministry in and amongst the Galilee area and then heading to Jerusalem, where eventually he's crucified and then is resurrected. So that's the Gospel of Mark. So again, I will pause here. If anybody has any questions, thoughts, queries, quibbles, or complaints, by all means, please say so. Luke and Acts are really a 2-volume set. Their authorship, again, is attributed to the disciple Luke, who was a doctor who helped Paul and traveled with Paul, and then set out, traditionally thinking, to write this history, not only of Jesus's life, which we see in the Gospel of Luke, but of Jesus's legacy, which we see in this book, Acts of the Apostles. We do know two things. One, that this was, if this was Luke, and there's strong evidence that it is, this was the only two books in the Bible written by a Gentile, by a non-Jew. And so they stand out for that reason. We also know that they were, like I said, a set, because if you look in the first set of verses of each book, in Luke verse 1-3, he addresses this book to a person he refers to as most excellent Theophilus. And then in Acts 1:1, he says, well, in the first book, Theophilus, ... I said these things, and now we're going to move on and say these things. So the odds that two different people who were completely not connected would be writing to this Theophilus character, who we believe was a Roman official that Luke was trying to convince of the truth of Christianity, are extraordinarily small. So we know that they were written by the same person. This is just a completely nerdy academic note, but I wanted to throw it in as well. When somebody asks who wrote the most words in the New Testament, people's usual answer would be Paul, right? Paul wrote a bunch of books. He must have written most of the words. Not true. The person that wrote the most words in the New Testament is Luke. Because of the size of Luke and the size of Acts, the person that wrote the most words actually was Luke. So Luke has a tremendous effect on how people think about Christ and how people think about Christ's church. Again, as I was saying, it was written to this Roman official, and really written for people who were on the fence about conversion, that had heard the stories. In Luke 1:4, it says, so you have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. His goal here is to say that people that have been introduced to Christianity but aren't quite sure about it, I'm going to write this as historical an idea as I can. And it's not, by far, not a perfect history, but of the four Gospels, it's probably the most historically correct. I'm going to write as close to the truth of history as I possibly can, so that you know, based on how I connect this to other historical events that we're all familiar with, that these things that are being written about Jesus are true. And so we're probably, again, talking to a mostly Gentile audience. Luke explains a lot of the Jewish customs and festivals. He also does a genealogy, whereas Matthew, when he writes his genealogy, connects Jesus's family history to Abraham, i.e. the patriarch of the entire Israelite nation. Luke takes them all the way back to Adam. Because again, Abraham's not a character that most Gentiles are going to grab a hold of and say, oh, this is a really important guy. The fact that Jesus was somehow related to him is a big deal. Whereas they know about who Adam was, and they know if Adam was the progenitor of the human race, that Jesus would be connected all the way back there, would offer a lot of reliability, would offer a lot of a strong foundation for the story. It also connects people in both Luke and Acts strongly to the book of Isaiah. We talked about this in the prophets. There's a lot of quotes in Luke specifically and Acts from Isaiah. There's a lot of stories that connect to Isaiah. If I'm thinking specifically in Acts 8, there's the story of an Ethiopian eunuch who had traveled to Jerusalem and was on some sort of cart or carriage being wheeled back, and he's reading a scroll. And when one of the apostles comes upon him, and they strike up a conversation, and the apostle's trying to explain to him how all these stories that he's reading in the scroll connect to Jesus. That scroll that the eunuch is reading is the book of Isaiah. So Isaiah has a very, very strong presence, specifically in this book, the Gospel of Luke, and also in the book of Acts. Luke is the second gospel. Luke and Matthew are the two gospels that have birth narratives. So anytime we're doing Christmas services and we're reading scripture from the gospels, there's a reason it's always Matthew and Luke. Those are the only two that tell the story of Jesus's birth. Mark was very specifically interested only in Jesus's ministry, and John, as we'll find out here in a few moments, is more interested in Jesus's connection to God than his physical incarnation. So when he talks about Jesus's origins, he talks about Jesus's cosmic origins, not necessarily his earthly birth. Another thing about Luke and Acts is that it stresses that salvation is for those on the outside of society, the marginalized, which is something that the modern church often forgets. This is another thing, Jane, kind of what we were just talking about, how the modern church picks and chooses what it tends to focus on. Forgiveness and healing are part of Jesus's ministries in all the Gospels, but particularly in Luke, there's also this sense of liberation that goes along with it. Liberation from evil, liberation from oppressive systems, liberation from evil spirits. That liberation is just as important as being forgiven, as being physically healed. All of that together, liberation, forgiveness, and healing, all of that together is considered God's saving effort through Jesus in his life and in his ministry. After the Gospel of Luke goes through the story of the crucifixion and Jesus's resurrection, Acts picks right up with the story. And there's stories of what Jesus did after he was resurrected in the book of Acts. And then, of course, it's a lot of stories about how Jesus's legacy affected the apostles, how the apostles spread the church. And again, so we have in Acts kind of three primary sections. There's chapters 1 through 8 are kind of the church in Jerusalem itself, where it started. And the pivotal point in there comes in chapter 7, where one of the apostles, actually it was Apostle Stephen, who I believe was the one picked to replace Judas, there's a big long soliloquy that they have from him in chapter 7, where he's reminding this Jewish audience that he's speaking to in Jerusalem of Israel's history and connecting Jesus specifically to that history. And they're so offended that he connects Jesus to this history, they stone him to death right then and there. And so funny, a lot of the other followers move on from Jerusalem after that particular act. And so we see in chapters 8 through about the middle of chapter 12 that the church spreads throughout Judea, which is that southern kingdom. It also spreads into Samaria, which is in that northern kingdom, and into the surrounding areas. And then finally, in the last third, the chapters 13 to 28, we see the church spread throughout the Mediterranean, and that's primarily considered with Paul's travels. Paul has 3 missionary journeys where he plants churches around the Mediterranean area, and that's that last third of the book of Acts. So that's Luke and Acts there. And we'll finish with John, and then we'll talk about other questions and other thoughts and concerns. Again, John traditionally attributed to the Apostle John, along with 3 letters that appear in the New Testament. We'll talk about those next week, and the book of Revelation, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. John is the only non-synoptic gospel. It's a reason that he gets set apart from the other 3. And that's because he takes a very different perspective. He's very much focused on Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, as the Son of God, as actually God himself. He's not as interested in a strict chronology of Jesus's life. Yes, he starts with this cosmic description of Jesus's existence, and then ends obviously with the death and crucifixion and resurrection. But in between, a lot of the stories are more grouped by topic, are more grouped by the idea that he's trying to get at, more than they are a strict chronology of Jesus's life. And he says almost as much in the second to the last chapter of the book. In chapter 20, verse 31, it reads, "But these things are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing that you might have life in his name." This is John's declared intent. I'm writing these things so that you have faith in Jesus and that you understand that Jesus is God. John also divides the book kind of into 2 sections. The first half of the book, chapters 1 through 12, is called the Book of Signs. There are 7 signs or specific types of miracles that are supposed to directly tell you something about Jesus's relationship to God that he goes through in these first 12 chapters. These are essentially, again, Jesus's public teachings. Chapters 2 through 4, he works some miracles on institutions in Judaism. Chapter 5 through 10, he makes appearances at Jewish festivals. The second half of the book is called the Book of Glory. This is chapters 13 to 21. These are Jesus. Now Jesus, instead of preaching to crowds and preaching to multitudes and preaching out in public, now Jesus is teaching just his apostles himself. There's a famous scene in John 13 where he's washing the disciples' feet and very specifically telling them, this is how you lead in God's kingdom, by serving other people, not by lording over other people and commanding them what to do, but by coming under them and serving their needs up to and including washing their very feet. It's why you see Pope Francis at certain points of the year will make very public displays of washing people's feet as he's trying to recall this particular story from the Gospel of John. So it's these private teachings of the apostles. Now, the other thing about John's gospel that sets it apart, and this will be the last thing I talk about here today, is that when you see the other 3 gospels, you see very much Jesus's humanity come through, right? We see Jesus being afraid. We see Jesus being tormented, Jesus being in pain as he goes to his crucifixion. A lot of that pain and torment and anguish is not present in John. You see a much more confident, a much more what we would call today strong leader type vision of Jesus in that. And again, that goes back to this idea of being connected to God. What do you have to be afraid of if you're actually God himself? And so John presents Jesus as this much more confident character, as this much more confident, strong presence than you would see in other Bibles, because he's not stressing the human part of Jesus as much as he's stressing the God part of Jesus. And you'll notice that as you go through and read the book of John. So that's what I have on the four gospels and the book of Acts. For those of you watching on YouTube, thank you for being with us. Remember, you can always leave comments and email me, danc@genesiscub.org. And we hope to see you with us next week.